Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to warmly welcome you all to today's panel discussion, which have the name of Passing the Two-Year Mark, the Biden Administration and the Central American Migration Crisis. I would like to warmly welcome you all. I'm going to be the moderator of the discussion today. My name is Róbert Gönczi. I'm a junior analyst at the Migration Research Institute. And my discussion partner today in this joint discussion of the Migration Research Institute and the Matthias Corvinus Collegium at Scruton is Kristóf György, senior researcher at the Migration Research Institute, who also spent the last 14 months at Washington, D.C. as an Andrássy National Security Fellow at the Center for Immigration Studies. Thank you, Kristóf, for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, without any further ado, let us dive into the topic right away. And let me state that the Central American migration crisis is seeming like a never-ending story with no solution so far whatsoever. However, we have seen great changes, especially since Joe Biden took office in Washington, D.C. Since January 2021. What would you say, what are the current characteristics of this crisis? And who are these migrants who coming to the U.S. southern borders, and where are they from?
Well, this whole crisis started during the Obama administration. It was around the year 2012 when unaccompanied children and families started coming from, not from Mexico, but from the northern triangle of Central America, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Regarding these migrants or asylum seekers, it's much more difficult to deal with them at the border as compared to the single adults that used to come from Mexico, because there are a bunch of laws in the United States that doesn't allow for these people to be expelled quickly for two reasons. The first reason is that these countries are so-called non-congruous countries, which means that they do not border the United States. And the other part is a few legislations that were passed in 2008 and 2009 that give special rights to children and children traveling in family units.
So when you're saying that most of them are not from Mexico, you are stating that what we usually hear in the American media, that people coming from Mexico are not even entirely Mexicans. Are even there any Mexicans between these migrants, or all of them coming from the South and Central American states? Or Mexico is a Northern American state, but to south from Mexico?
So the number of people coming, those people who are not Mexicans, started to rise in 2009. By the time that Donald Trump took office in 2017, the majority of people were from countries that are not Mexico, chiefly from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Right now, the Mexican share of the irregular migrants who show up at the US-Mexican border is below 10%. More and more people are coming, generally speaking, from every part of the American, of the Western Hemisphere, from Latin America. In the past year, we've seen a very fast increase of the number of people coming from Nicaragua and Venezuela, for example.
So do we see an escalation in the crisis? Do we see that more and more people coming during the Biden administration, or were these numbers the same during the Trump administration? What would you say?
First of all, when Biden took office, he inherited a frozen migration crisis from the Trump administration. Because during the COVID pandemic, President Trump evoked Title 42, which is a emergency healthcare measure that is in the United States Code. It allows the federal government to expel everyone who arrives at the southern border. citing public health benefits. The word expel is very important because Title 8 of the US Code, which deals with immigration, the keyword there is deportation. So none of the laws passed regarding the protection of asylum seekers apply if we invoke a law that doesn't deport them, but on the other hand expel them. When Biden took office, he changed the application of Title 42. He said that he directed the Department of Homeland Security, who's in charge of border security, to exempt unaccompanied children from being expelled under Title 42. But at the same time, also families, most of the families coming from Central America couldn't be expelled either because Mexico was not taking them back. While at the same time, in the past 2 years, there were a number of different nationalities, for example, Ukrainians at the beginning of the Russian invasion, and later Venezuelans and Nicaraguans who were exempt from the application of Title 42. So yes, there is an escalation of the crisis, first in numbers. In fiscal year 2022, that's the period from October 2021 to September 2022, we had 2.4 million apprehensions on the southern border. So first of all, the numbers are increasing, and second of all, this whole crisis that started out, as the subtitle says, a Central American migration crisis, is becoming more and more hemispherical in nature. People are coming from all around Latin America right now.
Can we say that Title 42, which was introduced because of the COVID measures in the US, is now outdated and should be abolished? Or do we see any future of the Title 42 to survive, even though we are in the post-COVID era of the 21st century?
Of course it's outdated. The healthcare emergency is over. As a tourist, you can travel to the United States. You only have to be vaccinated. So yes, it is an outdated measure, and it is a healthcare measure. And I would say that it's quite unhealthy that the administration is relying on a healthcare measure to address an immigration or a migration crisis.
So what is the future of it? Because the media was all around the debates about the Title 42, that different parties wanted to abolish it, other parties tried to take it to court. So what is going to happen with this?
Right now there is ongoing litigation around Title 42. First of all, the Biden administration wanted to get rid of it in April 2022. And then a number of Republican-led states sued the federal government, claiming that the Biden administration didn't follow the correct procedures which are lined out in the Administration Procedures Act, meaning that if the administration wants to change a policy, first it has to go through a so-called comment and notice phase, where they publish the new regulation and they give a certain amount of time. Sometimes it's 90 days, sometimes it's longer, for NGOs, politicians, or basically anyone to comment on the effects of this new regulation. So in May 2022, a federal court in Louisiana blocked the federal administration from abolishing this policy, claiming that they didn't go through this mandatory procedure. At the same time, another court in a completely different litigation that started in November 2021 abolished and permanently enjoined this policy in November 2022, claiming, just what I told you a minute ago, that this is not a border measure and using it's illegal. After that, the administration was supposed to stop applying Title 42 at the southern border on the 21st of December 2022. Republican states sued again, and the Supreme Court, the whole question ended up in front of the Supreme Court on the 28th of December, and the Supreme Court granted a stay to the states, meaning that right now the administration cannot abolish it up until the Supreme Court decides. But it's very important to note that the Supreme Court is not going to examine the merit of the case, meaning that the Supreme Court is not going to say anything about whether the Biden administration can use this measure, this healthcare measure, as a border enforcement tool. Rather, they will only decide if the states have the authority to have a say in this litigation. This is going to drag on for months. So Title 42 is not going away for another couple of months.
Can we agree on that most of these migrants who are coming to the southern US border are not refugees at all? They are coming for better economic circumstances to the US, to have jobs, to start a better life in the United States, yes?
Usually, when we ask this question, are they refugees or are they economic migrants, that is always an interesting question. What I can tell you is that most of them are not even asylum seekers, let alone refugees, because when they reach the southern border, what happens to them is they are granted humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole, according to Section 212D5, subsection A of the Immigration and Nationality Act, gives the administration the power to parole into the United States on a case-to-case basis. This is important, on a case-to-case basis, anyone for urgent humanitarian need. For example, if they don't allow them in the United States for medical treatment, then they die, or for significant public benefit. What the Biden administration has been doing is paroling almost everyone on the border, granting them parole and work authorization. So these people are just let into the United States, they can work, and they can apply for asylum if they want. Because granting you temporary humanitarian parole doesn't make you an asylum seeker. Most of these people who are let into the United States haven't even applied for asylum yet. In November 2022, it was 88,000 people who were let in like this on humanitarian parole.
So my question based on this is, what happens if some refugees, hardcore refugees who are coming from a war zone, like we see a number of Ukrainians arriving to the southern border of the US, are coming together with these people who are only coming for better economic circumstances. What can the US system do to pick out these refugees and help them quicker or more efficient than those who are coming for better economic circumstances? Is there anything that the US system can do?
First of all, since 1980, the United States has, it's called the Refugee Resettlement Program, that has an annual ceiling of 125,000 people per year who are to be resettled into the United States as refugees. At the same time, everyone can apply for asylum. They can apply from abroad. They can at the same time apply for asylum when they show up at the border. The system is not supposed to distinguish in any way from, say, someone from Salvador with a bogus asylum claim and between a Ukrainian refugee fleeing the Russian invasion. It is for the immigration court system to decide on the merits of every asylum claim. What the administration can do is to set up special custom-tailored programs for certain groups. For example, the Biden administration set up the so-called Uniting for Ukraine program in April 2022. It's based for Ukrainians, of course. It is a private sponsorship program. What Ukrainians who want to enroll in the program have to do is they have to find a private sponsor in the United States who signs that they will support them financially for 1, 2, or 3 years, and then they receive again an advanced humanitarian parole, the one that we talked about, and then they can fly to the United States. Using this program so far, more than 100,000 Ukrainian refugees has been relocated to the United States. The problem is that all these executive programs, they don't really have basis in the laws passed by Congress. So on the one hand, yes, it's helping Ukrainians, but at the same time, this is not what humanitarian parole was designed for.
Now we talked about humanitarian parole, but I would say that let's step back or even two, and let's see the bigger picture. So what happens to these migrants when they reach the southern borders of the US? What can they expect from the border guards?
First, I would like to say what they are supposed to expect and what's actually happening. So according to US law, it's been like this since 1996 when Congress passed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. First of all, everyone who shows up at the border and who is not admissible, who doesn't have a visa, is put into an expedited removal procedure. Expedited removal is pretty quick. Anyone can basically be removed from the United States unless they claim fear of harm. If they claim fear of harm, then they are moved into a regular removal proceeding where an asylum officer will decide if they have credible fear. Credible fear determination is a much lower bar than asylum determination. When an asylum officer assesses an asylum seeker's credible fear, then the asylum officer is basically just deciding if this person has a realistic chance of getting asylum from an immigration judge. If you pass the credible fear bar, then you get into a regular removal hearing, and you can get out of detention, and you can live in the United States with work authorization up until your case is decided, which sometimes takes 4 or 5 years. So this is the system. What Biden is doing is, first of all, some of the people are getting expelled under Title 42. It's a smaller and smaller percentage of the asylum seekers and migrants who show up at the southern border. Those who are not expelled under Title 42, they are paroled into the United States using this humanitarian parole provision, and at the same time they are enrolled into alternatives to detention. Alternatives to detention is basically an application on your smartphone where immigrations and customs enforcement sometimes send you a text message, hello, are you still where you're supposed to be? As you can guess, it's not as efficient as actually detaining people. So yes, most of the people are let in on humanitarian parole and alternatives to detention, and they get 6 months, 1 year of humanitarian parole, and they can decide what to do after that. Apply for asylum, not apply for asylum, or just disappear in the United States.
But ultimately, almost all of them have to go to stay in the US for at least a little time to work, to find a better life, etc. But what are their chances to really do that? What are the chances of the migrants to stay in the United States?
The chances right now are pretty high. First of all, there has been a regular... Let's first talk about those people who apply for asylum. There has been a recent regulatory change. At the first instance, right now, it's not it's not immigration judges who decide if someone is granted asylum. It's rather asylum officers. The same asylum officers who used to be the advocates for asylum seekers in these immigration hearings. So what we see is we are converting an adversarial setting, which you know, if you're in front of an immigration judge, then there's a prosecutor. That's an adversarial setting. We are converting an adversarial setting into a non-adversarial setting where the asylum seeker only has to convince an asylum officer to grant him asylum, and there is no prosecutor. Those people who do not apply for asylum, they can just decide to disappear in the United States and join the ranks of illegal immigrants. Right now, it's the agency who is supposed to step up against illegal immigration inside the country is called Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Since Biden came to office, he gave an order to Immigration and Customs Enforcement to only go after those illegal immigrants who commit an aggravated felony. Aggravated felony, murder, rape, something like that. So right now, even if you're an illegal immigrant, but you don't break the law, you don't kill someone on the street and the police doesn't catch you, then you have pretty good chances of being left alone by the authorities.
What is the conception of the American public about the crisis? So how does it feel inside the country? What do people think about this current situation that people in any absolutely huge numbers can come into the country, and basically the United States can't really do anything about it because they are so overwhelmed, and sometimes it doesn't even seem like they want to treat the problem. For example, I have heard a rumor recently that there is also an application where you can even tick out that you would like to illegally enter the country. Is that true? What can you tell about these?
So first about this application, it's called CBP-1. CBP is Customs and Border Protection. It's a new thing. They started to use it a month ago, 6 weeks ago in secret, and they just announced it. The administration just announced it last week. The point of this application is that you're in Mexico, you're a migrant, and then instead of crossing the border irregularly and getting apprehended by Border Patrol, you just download this application and tick out a few boxes saying that I'm planning to go to the United States illegally, and then Border Patrol gets notified, and then they send an email to you. Okay, please don't go to the river. Here is a port of entry that you can actually just come to, and please come at this time. Why is this good? Of course, it's a very nice management tool because if everyone just goes to the port of entries, then you can avoid those embarrassing scenes that, for example, we saw in September 2021 when 10,000 Haitians crowded under a bridge in Texas because Border Patrol couldn't process them quick enough. At the same time, using this application, the administration can cook the numbers. Border apprehension numbers, because those people who register on this application and then show up at the port of entry, they are not suddenly, magically, they are not irregular migrants. They showed up at the border, a port of entry, so the numbers of migrants apprehended at the border are going to go down, even though the actual number of people is not decreasing.
And back to the first part of the question, what does the American public think about this crisis, this never-ending crisis? Do they see this as a threat? Do they see it as a problem? Do they see it as a good thing? What do the American public think about this as total?
In the 1990s, Barbara Jordan, a great immigration advocate, said that if we cannot fix the problem of illegal immigration, then the nation is going to lose its faith in legal immigration. And that's exactly what's happening. If we look at polls conducted now in the population now and say 5 years ago, the number of people who says that immigration in general is good for the United States is sharply decreasing because of the border crisis. Still, at the same time, there is a huge political fracture between Democrats and Republicans. On the Republican side, Republican voters, for them, the border issue is a top 3 issue, while at the same time, on the Democrat side, it's not.
And about the Republicans, they recently took over the House of Representatives. Can we expect any solution from them to this current crisis, or there is no solution to this conflict and no side has any idea what to do with this is ultimately absolutely problematic situation?
There is not much the Republicans can do for 2 reasons. First of all, the Senate is still controlled by the Democrats, and the White House is also controlled by the Democrats. There are 2 things that a Republican-controlled House of Representatives can do. First of all, when it will come next year, not now, but when it will come to the negotiations about next year's budget, they will be able to basically blackmail the administration, saying, okay, if you don't change your immigration policies, then we will just not vote for the budget. Second, they can also set up investigative committees, select committees, like the one that was investigating the insurrection on the 6th of January about the policies of the Biden administration. They can officially ask people, high-ranking people from the Biden administration, first and foremost the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, to testify in front of Congress. And they can also impeach, maybe not the president, but they can also impeach, for example, Mayorkas. Kevin McCarthy, who just after a very embarrassing few days just got elected to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives, already said that if Mayorkas doesn't resign, then after that he can expect to be impeached.
Do you see any difference between how Democratic leading and Republican leading border states are treating illegal migration, or there is no possibility to do anything differently state to state? So, for example, do we see any difference how California, for example, taking care about this problem, and Texas?
First of all, according to a Supreme Court decision in 2012, immigration policy is the prerogative of the federal government. So when it comes to immigration enforcement, the states are not supposed to do anything. But at the same time, there are so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. There are sanctuary states, sanctuary counties, sanctuary cities, for example, California, San Francisco, where there are state-level laws that actually block state authorities to cooperate with federal authorities, like with immigration and customs enforcement. For example, they are not going to hand over, even if we are talking about someone who committed an aggravated felony, they are not going to hand them over to the federal authorities. So that person who, let's say, just killed a few people in California, yes, he's going to go to prison. He's going to be in prison for a very long time. But when his prison sentence is over, he's not going to be deported. That's how sanctuary jurisdictions work.
Before we continue to our next segment, where I'm going to ask you about your personal experiences in the US, I would like to tell the audience that there will be opportunity to ask your questions. Today we don't have Slido, so it will be an in-person asking. So please prepare your questions, whatever it is, and our colleagues will be ready to help you with the microphone. So back to the topic. As I mentioned earlier, you spent 14 months in DC. How would you evaluate your past 1.5 years, or little less, rather closer to 1 year? What was the US experience for you? How was it to work at another migration research institute, the Center for Immigration Studies in the US?
First of all, obviously, I learned a lot about migration in the United States. What really really was unexpected for me is the seriousness of the political fault lines regarding this issue. For example, I was supposed to, in April, go to San Francisco and give a series of lectures about the migration crisis in Europe, so not the United States. And at the last minute, I got cancelled because of cancel culture, because the people there thought that no, we don't want to hear someone coming from Hungary talking about migrants in Europe, because that's basically spreading hate. At the same time, I went to a conference in DC organized by the Migration Policy Institute, which is an immigration expansionist institute. And when I registered and went there, my colleagues at the Center for Immigration Studies told me, keep it a secret that you are from here. Like, write anything on your badge. Write Hungary Foundation, MCC, whatever. Just don't write Center for Immigration Studies. Okay. And then when I went there and started talking to people during lunch, one of them, a lawyer, started telling me this story. She said, and imagine 2 years ago, a guy from the Center for Immigration Studies came here. You know, the hate group. So the biggest problem in the United States is that the two sides are not talking to each other. They just refuse to talk to each other. It's completely impossible to have a conference where you have both sides, where experts from both sides can talk with each other and have an actual debate. And then the people in the audience can decide who won that debate. That is impossible right now in the United States, and it has been for a few years now.
And you have been Andrássy National Security Fellow, as you mentioned, founded by the Hungary Foundation. I see that there are some students in the audience. What would you say? Would you like to promote this program? Would you like to say that this is a program that's it's good for later on PhD students and after PhD postgraduate students is good to take? Or what are your experiences with this program?
I mean, it worked for me. I'm sitting here as an expert or something. Yes, absolutely. I think that in order to be able to do grounded, solid research on any subject, you have to be able to not just travel to the country that you're researching or you're doing research on, but at the same time, you should be able to spend there an extended amount of time in order to get not just the political culture, but also the policy culture surrounding that specific area that you are researching. So yes, everyone should apply for similar scholarships, yes.
And now a little back to the Central American migration crisis. You visited yourself the southern border plenty of times. What were your personal experiences at the border? How would you evaluate the current situation that you have seen with your eyes? I know you have been to the wall too, and what were your experiences with that, or with how this situation looks like as a person who have been visited that side that we are talking about?
Yeah, I visited the southern border twice. I don't know if that's plenty. I was in Texas, around El Paso, New Mexico in September 2021, and then I was in Yuma, Arizona in November 2022. First of all, I'm going to talk a bit about New Mexico. It's a beautiful country. Anyway, the construction of the wall was never finished. There are unfinished segments of the wall because when Biden was inaugurated as president, he stopped construction immediately. So you have these relatively shorter sections in the wall, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, which are just little gaps. Those are where the gates were supposed to be. But when you're constructing a barrier like this, it's the gates. That's the last thing that you put in place. So we were in New Mexico, around the place where one longer section of Trump's wall ended. There was the 10 of us. It was an organized trip, 10 of us with 2 big trucks. And we were just staying there, making photos, talking. We were there for almost an hour on this section of the border where the wall ended, and a group of 10 people with 2 trucks playing around on the US-Mexican border, and no one showed up. For a whole hour, no one showed up, no border patrol, nothing. So that's a very good indication about how overwhelmed the border patrol is right now, and how much they can actually patrol the border, which is the question of irregular migration is one thing. But at the same time, if the border is not patrolled, then drugs can come in from Mexico, most notably fentanyl. Right now, there's a huge fentanyl crisis in the United States that is killing a lot of people. So the second part of my trip, in Yuma, Arizona. Yuma is the lettuce capital. It's called the lettuce capital of the United States because during the winter months, close to 70% of the lettuce is grown there that they sell in the United States. They had a huge problem of irregular migration because the migrants coming to the Yuma sector of the border, there are also gaps there on the wall, would just come over and trample on the salad fields and destroy the crops. After the mayor of Yuma declared an emergency in December 2022, the then governor, Republican Doug Ducey, constructed makeshift barriers from old shipping containers. He just welded together shipping containers to close the gaps in the border wall, and he would just put a concertina wire on top of these old rusty shipping containers. It didn't stop the flow, but it channeled the migrants towards ports of entry. So the flow itself became much more manageable for the authorities.
But the lack of patrolling and the lack of wall, it seems quite frightening. How does the local population who are just living right next to the border, dealing with this issue day to day, that they are seeing drug traffickers, that they are seeing people entering illegally their towns? How do they feel about this? Have they moved, big percentage of them, have they moved from these towns that are bordering the border? Or what became the consequences of this chaotic situation at the border?
Those people who live in a rural setting, I'm talking about ranchers. This was in New Mexico. The ranchers living on the border, they are afraid. First of all, they are suffering damages. For example, this rancher guy that I talked to in September 2021, he told me that one evening some migrants destroyed a huge container that he was storing water in, that he was using for his cattle because he's raising cattle. And New Mexico is a very dry place. So some migrant destroyed the tap of this huge container to get some water, and during one evening all of the water was lost. We are talking 10,000 liters of water. That's thousands of dollars in damages that no one is going to pay for. At the same time, they are afraid not of the migrants, but of the cartel. The cartels and the smugglers who just come and go as they please, armed to their teeth. At the same time, if you go to communities which are bigger, Yuma has roughly 100,000 people. El Paso is even bigger. There, what federal authorities do is that they try to construct a conveyor belt of migration so that they can get out the migrants from these border communities as quickly as they can in order to ease pressure on border communities. The problem is that the Biden administration is looking at this migration crisis as if it was a natural disaster. They are treating it as if they could do nothing to prevent it or stop it. All the measures that they are implementing is basically to help to manage it.
Before I turn to the audience to ask their questions, I have one more question regarding the issue that is quite similar that what we see in the US and what we see in the European Union. Both of these countries are facing a huge migration crisis from the southern borders. But what would you say, what is the main difference between the situation at the southern borders of the European Union and the southern borders of the US?
Well, the main difference is that the United States has actually all the necessary tools and policies to solve their crisis. You just need the political willingness to do it. While in Europe, well, let's just say it's much more difficult to build a wall in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea.
That's true. Now, let the audience ask their questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hands and my colleagues will going to give you a microphone. If not, yes?
So I would have more of a politically ideological question of what do you think how the two parties are going to inform in their dynamics as of today, the Democrats seem to be the very progressive and very woke, culturally opened part of the world. And as of just on the elections night right here, we spoke about it 2 months ago, how the social security system got way worse within the past few years, and there are major social problems other than migration as well. And what do you think? Is there a possibility that the two parties will come to compromise?
On the issue of migration, I don't think so. Since President Trump took office in 2017, the rift between the Democrats and the Republicans on the issue of migration just became bigger and bigger. Right now, what we see is that inside the Biden administration, the centrist line is getting stronger. They are trying to beef up enforcement with baby steps. But still, we've seen in the past couple of weeks a bunch of smaller regulatory changes that made enforcement stricter on the southern border. But at the same time, the Republicans are still advocating for a complete change of basically everything that the Democrats are doing. In order to pass a comprehensive immigration reform in the United States, which has eluded Congress for the past 20 years or so, you need to have 3 issues, broadly speaking, that you have to address. The first one is the border. We've talked about the border. That's clear. You have to do something with border enforcement. The second one is that you have to do something about unauthorized employment. Right now in the United States, it's very, very easy to get an employment without authorization. And I'm not talking about working on the black market, like how you would imagine here in Hungary or here in Europe. I'm talking about big firms hiring people who don't have work authorizations, who are illegally in the country, and these people can pay taxes. They can have social security, they can have a pension fund, and at the same time, they are still illegal immigrants. So how is it fair that those companies can exploit these people? Up until this problem is solved, then you will have this great magnet of employment opportunities in the United States that is attracting migrants from Latin America, and there is no wall that can stop them from crossing. The third leg that has to be addressed is the question of the unauthorized population living in the United States, which is between 11 and 12 million people. Some kind of amnesty sooner or later will have to be passed for certain segments for this population, because you have people, hundreds of thousands of people, for example, DACA recipients, who were taken through the border against their wishes when they were 5 years old, 6 years old, and the only thing they knew from the world is the United States. They grew up in the United States, they worked there, paid taxes, etc. The problem is the Republicans will never agree to any kind of amnesty, while at the same time the Democrats will never agree to any kind of serious enforcement measure on the southern border. And at the same time, the third leg, big business, will never stop lobbying against stopping unauthorized work in the United States, because it's their interest to exploit illegal immigrants, because they don't complain, they don't have unions, they basically don't have rights. If they complain, then they can just get deported and get some new ones from Mexico.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this discussion. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is, where is Kamala Harris? She was named as the border czar, but it seems that she has disappeared or something like that. The second question is that, in general, how the US's government or administration is helping those in need who are very far from the US. For example, you have mentioned the Ukrainian refugee crisis as well, but what about, for example, with the Syrians residing in Turkey, or the Sub-Saharan Africans residing in any other refugee camps? So is the US government helping those people who are very far geographically? Thank you.
Well, where is Kamala Harris? That's a good question. It's a democratic tradition to name the vice president to be in charge of the border somehow. It's not a nice task to have. It's a kind of task that doesn't going to land you political victories or credit. When Biden was vice president, he was under the Obama administration. He was also in charge of border issues. It seems that even though Kamala Harris is supposed to be in charge, she's not really doing anything. She's supposed to focus on the root causes of migration. She's supposed to negotiate with Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador in investing in those countries to stop people from leaving there to the United States. But on this front, we haven't really seen anything in the past year. When it comes to helping those refugees who cannot actually trek to the southern border of the United States, since 1980, the United States has the refugee resettlement program that right now has an annual cap of 125,000 resettlements per year. This is the program that, for example, Syrian refugees could be resettled. The problem is that the office in charge of refugees resettlement is called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. The problem is that the human capacity of this office is completely overwhelmed by the border crisis, because those federal employees who are working at the Office of Refugee Resettlement are redirected to help with the management of the border crisis. And because of this, in fiscal year 2022, that ended in September, a mere 20,000 refugees were resettled from other parts of the globe, while at the same time the cap was 125,000. So how is that fair?
Hi, yeah, thank you. So diverging a little bit away from the federal government, what would states such as Texas and Arizona, Republican states, what means, tools, options do they have available to themselves to deal with the current crisis, completely separate from any influence of the federal government? So exclusively regarding them, what options do they have available to them?
Well, it's very difficult for the states to do anything because, as I mentioned, because of a Supreme Court decision in 2012, the enforcement of immigration law is only the prerogative of federal agencies. At the same time, that doesn't mean that the states can't do anything. For example, they can build their own wall, as Arizona and Texas tried. The problem is with building your own wall is that usually the border itself, because of the Roswell Declaration in 1907 in California, New Mexico, and Arizona, 60 feet from the Mexican border is considered federal land where no one can have any kind of development except the federal government. Because of the fact that Texas joined the United States as a federal state, as a sovereign state in 1845, because of that, the Roosevelt Declaration doesn't apply to Texas, meaning that basically there is no federal state land in Texas. All the state-owned land in Texas belong to the state of Texas. So in Texas, it's much easier for state authorities to start constructing their own border barriers. At the same time, the states can also resort to political theater. For example, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, a few months ago started offering migrants free bus rides to liberal cities like New York, Washington, Chicago, and most recently Philadelphia. This is not really going to do anything in easing the pressure on border communities because during the course of the past 5 or 6 months, Texas, I think, bused around 16,000 migrants out of border communities, but at the same time, it raises awareness. Because right now, the left-leaning press is just not talking about the border crisis. But when migrants start showing up in Washington and New York, and the liberal mayors of Washington and New York start complaining about the humanitarian disaster that's happening on their doorstep because of the Republicans are being mean to them in Texas, then the liberal press is starting to talk about the border crisis, and then the viewers can decide whose fault is that. Whose fault is that you have migrants in New York and the homeless shelters are being overwhelmed? Is it the fault of the governor of Texas who bust them there, or is it the fault of the federal authorities who allow for these people to be let in?
So if there are no more questions, I would like to have one more because we have just a little time. I would like to ask you to tell us about what is the other side of this migration crisis? Because we in Europe, we know that to protect the borders is just only one part of the problem. The other problem is the integration of the people who are arriving to our countries, to our nations. What is happening in the US? How well do these migrants who arrive through the southern border of the US integrate in the societies of the states? What would you say?
Well, in this regard, the situation in the United States is very different from that in the EU because, as I said, employment in the United States is the great magnet. that is attracting and has been attracting for decades now these migrants. They go to the United States to work. At the same time, in the US, you don't have the same kind of social safety net that we have in Europe. So at the same time, there is not a great cultural difference between these people. I mean, they are coming from Christian countries. So integration is not a problem in the United States at this point.
I ask the audience again if they have any questions left, because this is the time then. If not, Kristóf, György, Veres, thank you very much for the discussion today, and thank you very much for the audience for joining us to this brief discussion about the Central American migration crisis. We were the Migration Research Institute and the Matthias Corvinus Collegium. Thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you next time too. Thank you.
Thank you.